they're just missing. And here you have these two things. They're using these aren't kinetic hits. They're using a warhead that's supposed to spray out and like a shotgun shell and get the shrapnel hit. But the warhead's already passed it by the picking his toenails. No, these are guys who are studying some of the most advanced military technology in the world today, mastering it and coming up with the ability to defeat it. Array of weapons that's already been used against Ukraine, the Caliber missiles, Iskanders, the various cruise missiles and weapons of that sort. The Oreshnik was so far a one of escalation to open the possibility of strategic intervention, because the Oreshnik is a strategic weapon system. But Russia has been loath to go that route again, because the problem is once you normalize that escalation, then what's the next level? And I think Russia is recognizing that the Ukraine and their allies in Europe and the United States are just, excuse me for saying, batshit crazy. There's no rhyme or reason for what's being done here, except people trying to burn the house down, take the house down with them as the Biden administration goes, as Germany collapses, as France collapses, as Europe collapses, as NATO stutters. Let me put it in this perspective. When I was in Congress a week and a half ago, I met with a senior representative, and part of the discussion was the briefing that the CIA has been providing to the White House and Congress about Russia's new nuclear doctrine, and whether or not the lowering of the threshold was bluff or not by Russia. And the way that the mainstream media was portraying it was that the CIA was telling Congress and the White House that Russia was bluffing. And when I mentioned that...
All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. We've been looking at some pretty intense stuff lately, like the conflict in Ukraine and the kind of ripple effects it's sending all through the Middle East.
Yeah, it's been pretty wild.
We're talking about drone strikes hitting inside Russia, alliances shifting all over the place, and then this whole hypersonic missile thing. Like, that attack made even the most hardcore defense systems look kind of vulnerable.
Yeah, you're spot on. It's like we're seeing this whole reshuffling of, global power, and honestly, it raises some serious questions about what the future even looks like.
So let's break this down a bit. I was reading about these drone strikes in Russia, and, it's one thing if they're hitting military targets, but we're talking about apartment buildings and, beauty salons getting hit. There was even an attack on a kindergarten in Kazan. It's scary stuff.
Yeah, it's unnerving for sure. And, it's interesting. The thing about these attacks is that in terms of military strategy, they don't really, they don't pack much of a punch. But the political impact, that's a whole different story. These attacks, they could be a desperate move by Ukraine. They're trying to claw their way back into some kind of control as this conflict just drags on.
Right. Or maybe they're trying to get a reaction out of Russia. Or even, pull NATO into the whole thing.
Exactly. It's like a high-stakes poker game where every move is risky. This is what they call, escalation management. It's this balancing act. Russia has to figure out, okay, how do we respond in a way that shows strength but doesn't set off this chain reaction that could lead to something even worse?
Like a full-blown war with NATO.
Yeah, or even, a nuclear conflict. It's a very delicate situation.
Yeah, you're right. And speaking of strategic moves, something else kind of jumped out at me. The CIA director, Bill Burns, visited Ukraine recently. And usually these kinds of trips are kept hush-hush, right? But this time, they actually announced it publicly.
That's right. It's definitely not the usual way of doing things.
Yeah.
And, I think this public announcement, it was deliberate. It was like a message, maybe aimed at different audiences. It could be a way to reassure Ukraine that they still have the U.S. support.
Or maybe even a way to kind of rein them in if they're thinking about doing something too risky.
Possibly, yeah. Or it could also be a signal to those European allies who might be, getting a little shaky in their support, especially with all the political uncertainty back here in the U.S.
Right. This visit, it really makes you think about the CIA's role in all this. They're deeply involved in Ukraine, operating with a lot of autonomy, a lot of resources. It's kind of hard not to wonder, how much control is there over what they're actually doing?
That's a really important question, you know? Like, the CIA in Ukraine, it raises concerns about transparency and accountability. Are they, always acting in line with the broader U.S. strategy? Who's ultimately responsible for the decisions they're making on the ground?
It's like a black box.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that's a pretty worrying thought.
Definitely. It's a reminder that there's a lot going on that, we don't even see. But let's shift gears a bit, talk about the Middle East. I saw this footage of a hypersonic missile launch coming from Yemen, of all places.
Oh, wow.
And it managed to hit its target in Israel. The crazy thing is, the Israeli interceptors, which are supposed to be like top-notch, couldn't stop it.
Yeah, that was a wake-up call for a lot of people. It showed that even like the most advanced defense systems, they've got weak spots, especially when you're talking about new technologies like these hypersonic missiles. And they're so fast, it makes them incredibly hard to track, let alone intercept.
It kind of makes you wonder, like, what does defense even mean anymore in this new era of warfare?
It's a good question. The old rules don't really apply.
And what really got me was that this attack, it was carried out by Houthi forces in Yemen. Usually we think of state actors when we're talking about this kind of advanced weaponry. But this just shows that non-state actors, they can get their hands on these game-changing technologies too.
Oh, absolutely. The Houthis have been incredibly resilient, adapting to years of conflict and still managing to get a hold of and use this kind of sophisticated weaponry. Their success, it really challenges the traditional ideas we have about like power and security. It shows that even groups outside the established world order, they can pose a serious threat.
It's like a reminder of how quickly things can change, how the balance of power can shift. And, speaking of shifting power dynamics, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, Donald Trump. He's about to be president again. And what does that mean for this conflict in Ukraine, for relations with Russia?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Trump's stance on the Ukraine conflict, well, it's been complicated, to say the least.
Yeah.
I mean, on one hand, he's talked about negotiating with Russia. He's even praised Putin. But then, on the other hand, he's also said he supports Ukraine. It's a confusing mix of signals, and honestly, it's really hard to say what he'll actually do once he's back in the Oval Office.
It's like he's trying to play both sides.
Right, which maybe that's a strategy in itself. I don't know, but it gets a lot of uncertainty. And it's not just him. You've got people like Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy. These are influential figures who have his ear, and they could definitely sway his decisions.
It feels like we're heading into some really uncharted territory with U.S. foreign policy.
You're not wrong. It's a whole new game with a whole new set of rules, and figuring out how it's all going to play out, well, that's a challenge.
It definitely feels like we're at a crossroads here. We've got these conflicts that are intensifying, technologies that are evolving at lightning speed, and a major shift in the political landscape. It's a lot to unpack, but I think it's time to dive even deeper.
Okay, let's do it.
All right, so buckle up, everyone. We're going in.
What's really striking about all of this is that it shows like a fundamental shift in how global power works. We're not in a world that's just about nation states anymore.
Right.
I mean, look at the Houthis, like we were just talking about. Non-state actors, they're stepping onto the world stage with serious tech, with the ability to go toe-to-toe with even the biggest, most powerful countries.
It's like all the old rules, they've gone out the window.
Right. These groups, they aren't playing by the same playbook as traditional states. It's like they can operate with this like freedom, this agility that makes them incredibly difficult to predict and even harder to counter.
It feels like we're in uncharted territory here.
Yeah, and then you add in things like hypersonic missiles, and it just gets even more complex. I mean, these weapons, they can completely change the whole idea of how wars are fought, It makes it so much harder to prevent aggression, to keep a balance of power.
I was reading that these hypersonic missiles, they can travel at like 5 times the speed of sound. It's kind of hard to even wrap your head around that.
It's insane, right? Like how quickly they can strike a target, how hard it would be for like our current defense systems to even react in time.
It really is a game changer.
Oh, absolutely. And it's forcing everyone to rethink their strategies.
Yeah.
You can't just rely on like building bigger walls or stockpiling more weapons. You got to be nimble, adaptable, and you have to anticipate these threats that are changing faster than ever before.
It seems like, intelligence gathering, analysis, all of that becomes even more crucial in this environment. You need to be able to identify these threats early on, like figure out what they're capable of if you want any chance of stopping them.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the CIA and their whole role in all this. They're operating in a very let's just say, a murky world with a lot of autonomy and, well, it seems like there's limited oversight.
Yeah, and with this new administration coming in, and they've promised to shake things up.
Right.
I remember when Trump tried to reform the intelligence community during his first term, it didn't really go so well.
No, it didn't.
A lot of pushback, a lot of resistance from the intelligence agencies themselves.
You know, the intelligence community, it's a powerful force. It's got its own internal workings, its own priorities, and they don't always see eye to eye with the political leadership.
Even when they're supposed to be working together.
Right, exactly. And that can create a lot of friction, a lot of uncertainty, especially in a situation like the one we're seeing right now, which is, very volatile.
It makes you wonder, like, who's really in charge here? Is there enough communication, enough coordination between, like, the intelligence agencies and the people who are actually setting U.S. foreign policy?
That's the million-dollar question, and I don't think anyone has a clear answer right now. But what we do know is that this lack of transparency, it can be dangerous, especially when you're dealing with high-stakes situations where one wrong move, one misunderstanding, it can have some really serious consequences.
Yeah. Speaking of misunderstandings, I can't help but think about the potential for things to get lost in translation between the U.S. and Russia, especially with Trump back in the picture. I mean, Putin recently came out and said that the world is at war with Russia.
Yeah.
Do you think these drone strikes that have been hitting inside Russia, do you think that's changed how he views the conflict?
It's hard to know what's going on in Putin's head,
Yeah.
but that statement, it's definitely a sign that he's feeling the pressure.
Right.
He's trying to control the narrative, make it look like the West is the aggressor, rally support at home. It's a classic tactic.
And with Trump coming back into office, it almost feels like Putin's trying to influence how he sees the situation. I mean, he knows that Trump has talked about being willing to, engage with Russia in the past, and he's probably trying to use that to his advantage.
That's a good point. Putin's a master strategist. He's thinking long-term. He's not just reacting to things as they happen. He's trying to set the stage, lay the groundwork for negotiations, and ultimately achieve his goals in Ukraine.
But there seems to be a disconnect between what Putin's saying and what's actually happening. I mean, I've seen reports that Trump has reassured European leaders that he's still committed to supporting Ukraine.
Right.
How does that line up with his talk about negotiating with Russia?
It's classic Trump, isn't it? Playing both sides, keeping everyone guessing. He loves that kind of uncertainty, that discord. But the problem is that approach can backfire, especially in these complex geopolitical situations that really need, careful diplomacy, a clear understanding of what's actually going on.
So you're saying that his unpredictability could actually make things more volatile, more dangerous.
Exactly. When you're dealing with a leader like Putin, who's, very calculated, very strategic, being unpredictable can be a real liability. It's hard to build trust, to have clear communication, to find any common ground for negotiation.
It's a recipe for disaster, basically.
It could lead to miscalculations, to escalation, and that's the last thing anyone wants in this situation.